So now, origins of the city. I think as human beings, we're interested in where we came from, you know. I think, again, this can be slightly deceptive as to having any real significance, but it is a pretty fundamental question. There are myths of origin. Every culture, every civilization had one. In 1650, the Common Era, the Archbishop of Armagh, Brit, named James Ussher, calculated that the Earth began in 4004 BC. That was it. He did that using the evidence that he had, which was back in the biblical text to try to determine exactly when the Bible would say the Earth began. The master at Cambridge University named Dr. John Lightfoot thought that he was wrong, and so he began his study, and he concluded, in fact, that he was right, that the Earth began in 4004 BC, but further, it began on the 23rd of October at 9 a.m. in the morning. I'm not making this up, okay? Now, Aristotle, much earlier, had calculated the Earth, and Epicurus as well, as being much, much, much older. And there was a Chinese mathematician in the 18th century, Xing, who actually had calculated that the Earth was hundreds of millions of years old. The reason I raise this is, even if we knew exactly when cities began, or when the Earth began, or when anything else began, what would we do with that information? How would we apply it? What good would it do us? Right? And you can't really answer that question unless you believe that there is some completely divine type of city, ba-boom, and that's it, and we should try to vary from that as little as possible, as the Romans believed. It doesn't seem to matter when they began. Nonetheless, the fact that we are human beings and we're talking here in a course about cities, it seems to me worth sort of talking about that, if only briefly. I took a lot of slides out of here because this lecture was too long. But so let me say that one of the pieces of evidence that we have today that Dr. John Lightfoot and the Archbishop of Armagh did not have, 1650, is that we have the mapping of the human genome. And this is really, I think, a revolution in understanding our past and our origins. And some pretty astounding things have come from that that have sort of turned all the conventional understanding of human origins kind of on their head. It appears right now, by tracking mitochondrial DNA, that everyone in this room is related. In fact, everyone on Earth is related. And we're all descended from a very small population of people who lived on the southeast coast of Africa around 135,000 years ago. Possibly a population as small as 3,500 people. But these people, unlike their close relatives, apparently developed an extensive ability to modify their environment to suit them. And then for unknown reasons, there appears to have been a very rapid migration, 2 waves of rapid migration out of Africa, following the coast, up into what is now the Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula and on around into India. Others went up the river valley into Egypt, the second one, and then across, following the coastline, up into Turkey, Central Asia, and so on. Very, very, very long time ago. Now, some of the funny things that sort of appear with this mapping of the human genome, and this makes me laugh, is the notion that I am 4% Neanderthal. That actually, if you are of European or Asian descent, you are probably carrying up to 4% Neanderthal genes in you, right? That's hilarious to me. I don't know why I think that's funny, but I really do think that's funny, because I'm old enough to remember sort of cavemen when I was in grammar school, you know, so I think I'm related to these people, you know, somehow. But the other astonishing thing that is, I think, even more significant, far more significant, is that the people who live today on the east coast of Africa are more closely related to people living in Indonesia than they are to people living on the west coast of Africa. Right? What does that tell you? That it's easier to get around in the ancient world on water than it is on land. Right? And that will become important in the diffusion of cities. Now, whoever these people were, and we don't know when, we don't know who they were, we don't know what kind of language they spoke, we don't know their ethnicity, we don't know anything. But the group of people who settled in this region that we see here had an advantage that no one else had. The clue is on the screen. Can anybody guess what it was? Well, they had rivers, yes, that's very important, right. But what was the other advantage? Huh? Domestic animals. Or I should say it's the indigenous home of 4 critical animals that are domesticable, right? Goats, sheep, horses, and cattle. Cattle are indigenous originally to the Indus Valley. Horses originally were from North America. They were about the size of a dog. They died out. Somehow they got across into Asia. And once they hit the steppes of Central Asia, southern Russia, they had these open prairies and grasslands, and they started to grow big. Well, if you had a goat, you had an advantage, right? A real advantage. Now, there are domesticable animals elsewhere. You can domesticate an elephant, right? But what is the sexual maturity of an elephant? 15 to 18 years. So if your lifespan is 30 years, right, an elephant has one other elephant. And then you got to wait another 15, 18 years, right, to have another one. Goats are sexually mature at 6 months. So in 1 year, 2 goats can become 6 goats, can become 12 goats, can become 18 goats, and within about 3 years, you have a whole flock of goats. And what do you do with goats? You can eat them. You can milk them. You can make cheese from them. You can make leather from them. You can get their skins, right? You can do all kinds of things with goats. And what is the other great thing goats do? They eat your garbage, right? Not a bad thing to have around, goats. You could even make, I would make, that, you could make the argument that goats are the basis of civilization. I don't know, but I sort of like that, slightly tongue-in-cheek. Well, if you had goats, and they're very close relative sheep, and if you had a horse, I mean, you can domesticate a turkey, but you can't hook a plow up to it, right? You can domesticate a chicken, but you can't make shoes out of it. You follow me? You don't get milk from it. You don't get cheese from it. So you get eggs. That's a pretty good thing to have. But so these people had a great advantage. You said it earlier. They had rivers, but what else is on this map that's pretty clear? Lots of water. Lots of water. So once you are in a place like, let's say, here, and you actually are close to this river, close to that river, the Persian Gulf, Caspian Sea, so forth, it is easier for things to diffuse in the east-west than it is north-south. In fact, there's no evidence that the Incan civilization in Peru even knew that the Mayan civilization existed and vice versa, because it had to pass through a tropical zone. So it's very difficult for food and for other things to move north-south because you're moving through different climatic zones where it's much easier to move east-west. And once it hits the Mediterranean, I should also mention that of the 32 edible grains in the world today, 28 of them are indigenous to this part of the world. So let's just say these people got really lucky, okay? And so it isn't surprising that if we, at present knowledge, we may find older things in Africa, we may find older things in Asia, we may even find something in North or South America. I doubt it, but we might. But as of today, the oldest known permanent human settlement on Earth was in southeastern Turkey, right close to Syria, where a lot of fighting is going on, in the Kurdistan region here of Iraq, at a place called Göbekli Tepe. And it goes back 13,000 years before the present, right at the end of the recession of the last ice age. And it was a religious shrine. There were several of these built. No evidence, like Stonehenge that I mentioned, no evidence of a permanent settlement. only that people would gather there actually for apparently religious purposes. There are these round monolith stones that are created in a circle. They have all sorts of beautiful carvings on them in bas-relief of serpents and scorpions and all kinds of things. And we don't know who these people were. Obviously no written language. All we have are these stones. Discovered about 15, 20 years ago. And they go back a long, long way. Likewise, next is Jericho, a city that is an oasis, a naturally occurring oasis on the Jordan River just north of the Dead Sea. And the third, which is in your textbook, Çatal Huyuk, also in Turkey. And there's some question as to whether or not these were cities. We know this was not. There's debate about whether these were. So let's take a look at those. And then later, for sure, the red dots are cities, by my definition. All right? In Egypt, at Ur and Uruk, in the Mesopotamian Delta, and then Hattusas, also in Turkey. So if we look at Jericho, there are successive levels of occupation. The first is what's called the Natufian Proto-Neolithic period. You don't need to remember all of this other than, I might ask on a test, Jericho was occupied by the Natufians. Was it a city or something, right? And then all of this sort of pre-pottery and everything from what they was excavated by Kathleen Kenyon right after World War II, the British archaeologist. And I was there doing some work for the Aga Khan a number of years ago, 1983, and I took a trip there to see what I could find. And basically, it looks like this. I mean, there's not, it doesn't do you much good. But there's evidence of continuous occupation at Jericho, except for about a 200 to 300 year period when it appears to have been abandoned. And it's what's called a tell, which is a sort of an artificial mound that rises above the floodplain of the Jordan River. These artifacts, again, this memorial function that we see here with human skulls that actually have various kinds of stones set in the eyes that appear to have been ceremonially associated with some form of worship. Here's the mound of ancient Jericho. This is the modern city that we see today. The Jordan Valley is up there. And the only thing we have are these few walls and some steps and other things. There's not a whole lot going on there other than these burials. So Jericho isn't going to tell us much. However, Çatal Huyuk, which has been continuously excavated now for about the past 3 decades in Turkey, very old, not as old as Jericho, but very old, we know a lot more about. Now, when you look at this archaeological map that we see here of houses, what do the black lines look like? Streets? They're not streets. They're party walls. In fact, you entered the house through the roof. They had no streets, right? And even more peculiar, they buried their dead under their floors, which is a very strange thing. You don't see that very much in the ancient world. So this is Çatal Huyuk. They appear to have controlled a material, obsidian, a black volcanic naturally occurring glass that was easily worked into sharp cutting instruments, and thus they controlled this material and they could create trade. But again, we don't know what language they spoke. We don't know anything about them. We only know this. And there's one of an ancestor buried under the floor of the house. So, no streets. So is it a city? Not by my definition. It had no streets. Did it have a memorial function? Yes, but it was entirely embedded within the dwelling itself. And we see this rather fanciful reconstruction. There's our sheep and our goats, where people are up on the roof, and this is actually the access down into the dwelling itself. So is this a permanent human settlement? Yes, absolutely. Is it a proto-city? Yes, I think we can call that. Is it a city in the way that we are talking about cities here? The answer is no. Now, Kostov also mentioned, and I've just mentioned, trade, but also the development of writing. They appear to go hand in hand. If you are trading with people, you have to have some medium of exchange. You have to keep records of things. You record it. You write it down. The king owns this many sheep. So-and-so owns that many. And if we go all the way back here to sort of the time of Jericho and move it forward, we see that writing comes in independently sometime around 6,000 years before the present. And it occurs independently and simultaneously in the Mediterranean world, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, as well as in China. Now, writing, I would argue, the impulse to record is human, and very old. It goes back, actually, perhaps to these kinds of things that we see here, the recording of a hunt, the exploits of a group of people, something. And then we see here this little girl saying, I will not write on the walls. She's actually saying, I will write on the walls. And if we go back and look at Egyptian architecture or Greek architecture, what we see, of course, is lots of writing all over walls, right? Sort of, again, part of that memorial function. Trade. Well, as trade developed, I'll have to tell you a true story. I was in Korea about 10 years ago, or less, maybe 8 years ago, and I was giving a talk there, and they very gracious people. They asked me if I wanted to go see these tombs from the Silla dynasty. It's about 600 AD. I said, yes, and I'm in these tombs, and I look, and I said, that looks like Roman glass. And the woman said, that's very good. How did you know that? And I said, well, Rome, I know a good bit about Rome, and it just looked like Roman glass to me. She said, yeah, isn't that something? It was in the tomb. So what that means is that people were trading as far as the Korean Peninsula with the Roman world at least at 600 AD, 600 of the Common Era. The sort of centers of trade appear as these sort of circles and lines that we show here, and then eventually moving much closer in time to the present, we have two main language groups that begin to develop: the Semitic-speaking people and the Indo-European-speaking people, from Sanskrit that we see here all the way up to English, which is an Indo-European language, as is Greek and Latin, Arabic being a Semitic language, and so forth. And these groups, guess where they butted up against one another? In this very area, this very old part of the world that we see here. This is the Semitic-speaking part. There are even some languages like Assyrian, which are agglutinative, kind of hybrids between the two. Aramaic was a kind of hybrid between the two. The Indo-Europeans here on the north, and then trade. And all the action is in the sort of lavender areas that we see in between. Again, along rivers, along coastlines, so on and so forth. Central to this and the development of alphabetic writing, as opposed to hieroglyphs or symbolic writing, is actually the Phoenicians. In fact, we have a word that's, we use it all the time, right? Phonetics, right? It goes back to Phoenicia, right? That's where it comes from. The Phoenicians were central to this trade. They lived in what is now Lebanon, the area of the eastern Mediterranean called the Levant. They founded a city in Africa called Carthage. And they were dealing with both Indo-European and Semitic-speaking people in all these different languages. So they tried to develop a phonetic symbology so that they could communicate. You could communicate to different groups. And so, alpha, beta, A, B, etc., came from the Phoenicians. And we have in the Semitic world Aleph, Bet, in the Indo-European Alpha, Beta. They're obviously coming from the same place, which is Phoenicia. And just, you might find this interesting. We won't dwell on it today, but you have completely different words for father, like Ab, Apt, Abba. In Indo-European, Pater, Pita, Pedar. Mother, Mater, Matar, Ima, etc. Right? Totally different sounds that are arising for very common words that any group of people anywhere would have. A word for sky, a word for tree, a word for father, a word for mother. We'll just leave that and go on and look very quickly here at Mesopotamian cities. As the ice receded, the flat, broad areas of the Euphrates and Tigris Valley became what's called a braided delta. Braided. Because it was flat, the rivers are doing this as opposed to being in a channel, right? So these braided deltas, in the center of these were these hummocks or high ground, and it appears that this is in fact where cities in Mesopotamia were first built. One of the oldest, Ur, that's it. That's the aerial photograph of Ur, and interestingly enough, the river of course has shifted, but you can still see the outline of the wall, the outline of the city here. And you can actually, as we'll see in a moment, the location of two harbors that were constructed here that allowed for river to dock the ships on the river. This is an overlay then of the memorial or monumental architectural pieces. These people were fantastic artists. And this is sort of a fanciful reconstruction of it today. Similar cities, sister city of Uruk, again, the temple construction here that we see actually like an onion radiating out, this concentric sort of walls of significance. Larsa, another one. And then this one, which we saw a moment ago with its Assur, showing this dendritic structure that we see here. This was excavated by German archaeologists, so they have names like Winkelgasse Strait, stuff like that. I can tell you it wasn't called Winkelstrasse Street or something in, Winkelstrasse in 3000 BC. Or this, again, which is the residential portion of Ur, which we can actually map land use on. The numbers that you see here are is the distance, the number of rooms that you have to go through in order to get to the back part of the house. So these are party walls that we see here with an entrance here off this cul-de-sac. Most likely, we don't know, it was probably organized tribally, and so we end up here with probably what amounts to an extended family. We do have some street front retail. We have the square of the bakers. We even have a school, and at this important intersection, we have a small shrine or temple, just like we would have in a modern or contemporary city. Okay. Now, this is a much later medieval city in Iran that was frozen because of a terrible earthquake. But if we compare this to this, what we see is a sort of similar thing. What we have is a circuit wall around the whole thing. Then we have a citadel that we see here. We have a religious structure that we see here, sort of monumental structure. We have a secondary city here, which was probably associated with these two things, and then the normal population, which is living here. It becomes sort of useful, I think, to just look at that, because we can then sort of imagine better what these things might have looked like, even though Iran is Indo-European speaking and Mesopotamia was Semitic. In the last 2 minutes, Egypt is very different. Egypt, also a great river civilization, but here the Nile is in a very, very defined channel. And so surrounded on either side by desert, no need for defensive walls. And, of course, the entire life of these people depended upon the Nile. All of their myths of origin and so forth were associated with the Nile. They were completely and utterly dependent upon it. If we go to El Amarna, which is, unfortunately, there aren't a lot of ruins of Egyptian cities left. There are some monumental complexes, quite a few, very famous, but we don't have much of the cities because they're covered up. They're covered up by the sands and so forth. I want to go through this because I want to make one quick point. Mark Lerner wrote an article not long ago that sort of overturned the conventional understanding of Egyptian civilization, where the slave society and so on, they built the pyramids, saying that, no, looking at the diet of these people, right, in the garbage pits, these were not slaves. These were people who lived fairly well. And they probably were hired artisans, hired craftsmen, so on and so forth. And makes the statement that I like. He says, the pyramids built Egypt. Egypt did not build the pyramids. Now, what does he mean by that? I'll say that again when we get to Florence, that the Duomo built the Renaissance did not build the Duomo, right? Because once you have organized yourselves, once you have labor, once you've stratified the society in skilled labor, organized material, organized men, organized everything to do this, what do you do for a second act? You don't just do it once, right? And so what he means literally is that the act of building these great monumental structures then led to the continued construction of more and more and more and more, and that ancient Egyptian civilization was really developed from that organization. I think that's true. Now, we're out of time, so we will come back and look in some detail at the Egyptian cities because they are the polar opposite of the Mesopotamian cities. I want to go back and compare Egypt and Mesopotamia because we sort of ran over that very quickly. In the last lecture's PowerPoint notes, you will see images of two places. One is Hattusas, which was the headquarters of the Hittite Empire in central Turkey, a very powerful Indo-European speaking people who apparently migrated into that area, displacing the existing indigenous population. They were great traders and exerted tremendous influence to the south. They traded a lot with Egypt, and actually we know from hieroglyphic records in Egypt that they provided at least one Egyptian queen. And they appear in the Bible as well. The second is Mohenjo-Daro. Mohenjo-Daro was an Indus Valley civilization, very old, going back 3,000 BC, and it disappeared. And we're not sure why it disappeared. There were two cities associated with it that have been excavated. This is known as the Harappan civilization. And they were apparently related to the sort of Indo-European groups. And we say that because they use orthogonal geometries, and there are certain indications that some of the cultural affinities were similar to some of the things that we see later in Iran and other places that were Indo-European speaking. But these people disappeared, and who they were and what they were, we don't know. So the two cities were Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Morris talks about this in his book, but we are going to omit those from the lectures, even though they're in the PowerPoints, simply because we are trying to compress time. I do want to compare Egypt and Mesopotamia, however, because I think it forms this sort of polar opposites of a dendritic pattern in the case of Mesopotamian cities, as we saw at Assur and Ur, and the orthogonal geometries of large areas that are planned as a unit that we see in Egypt. And I want to draw a very important comparison between those two. This is Uruk, the sister city of Mesopotamian cities, sister city of Ur. And we see at the core of this, it was in fact a temple complex, probably associated with a very powerful ruler. And then it gets rather vague as this artist's reconstruction moves out from that monumental core. But it was probably very much like Assur, which we would see here in this dendritic pattern of sort of dead-end streets that are really tertiary streets operating off of secondary streets, which are operating off of primary streets in this kind of dendritic pattern. And it's probable that in these places what you had was a large extended family that's around the red area that you see here, in which there are various entrances that are possible to recreate in this German archaeological map from the early part of the 20th century. In contrast, Egypt used orthogonal geometry, and their cities show all the hallmarks of being planned as an entire unit. We know a lot about Egypt and their monumental complex. Surprisingly, monumental architectural complexes, we know surprisingly little about their cities. The cities either disappeared, they were built on top of, they were flooded, they were swept away. There are a few. Kahun is one, But the one that has drawn the most attention is Tel El Amarna. Now, Amarna may or may not be typical of all of these Egyptian cities that date back into the second millennium BC. But I say they may not because it was built by a peculiar pharaoh who, for a very brief period, sort of elevated Atun-Ra as the one god from whom all others. So he was a monotheist, which is very different from all that came before him and what became immediately after. So there's some questions then. Well, if he was peculiar enough to do that, then is it possible that he was peculiar enough to actually have created very different kinds of cities? And the answer is we don't know, because there just isn't enough evidence to be conclusive overall, at least none that I am aware of. This was a royal compound that was built by Akhenaten, and it's built in several pieces. Now, what's interesting about this, I think this is typical of Egypt because they were in this, unlike the braided rivers that we see in Mesopotamia, the Nile is in a very narrow channel until it gets to the Mediterranean, where it fans out into a delta, a regular delta. But it has a very regular floodplain, and it floods to that area, and you can almost stand on a line where there is green and there is desert. And that was the entire lifeblood of Egyptian civilization. They didn't have too many enemies because they were protected by substantial desert on both sides, so these cities typically did not have defensive walls, and they were strung out along the river, up and down the river, because the river was the primary, not only the lifeblood, but the means of communication and transportation as well, as it still is in many respects. And what we have then are a series of these that seem to be, at first glance, disconnected from, one from the other. What we're really looking at here are unexcavated areas with a royal road that is paralleling, in fact, the river. And there's a slight rise in the ground, and typically Egyptian cities, Egyptian architecture in general, would be built on this slight rise, right, not on the arable land, but just outside the arable land. What we have then is a temple complex to Aten-Ra, the great sun god, Ra or Re, and a series of royal buildings or buildings that were associated with the pharaoh. Military headquarters, here is the pharaoh's house. Here we have a sanctuary, storehouse in the service of the Aten. This is where the relics of the god were kept and so forth, that kind of thing. And then storehouses here, and then this large temple that we have here to Aten-Ra, which is always in this kind of this procession along a central axis. As we move down the river, or in this case up the river because the Nile flows north, we see these residential complexes that we see here, often referred to as Complex B. The assumption is that these were satellite towns, or the working part of the town that was associated with the activities of the pharaoh. Now, when we sort of begin to examine bits and pieces of these, though, what we see is something quite different from what we see in Mesopotamia, and that is regularized units that are clearly a subdivision of an overall scheme, an overall plan. And whenever you see this kind of regularity, what it means is that you are looking at something which is planned as a unit. Now, A.E.J. Morris and many other authors will use the term organic to describe this kind of dendritic pattern that we see at Ur and Assur and other places. This is a term I reject. I do not believe that cities are, in fact, bacterium. I don't think they grow in a petri dish. I don't think they are, scattered seeds that just somehow take root. They are planned, but they may be planned on the margins by a process of accretion. Someone is adding to something marginally without an overall plan, all right? And so it takes on this pattern which doesn't conform to any sort of known geometries such as this, and therefore many authors will use the term organic. I believe it is an incorrect term. Nonetheless, it's a textbook for this course. When I say an organic pattern, that's what I mean, okay? It doesn't mean that it's actually growing like my dog or something, okay? Weeds in the yard kind of thing, you know? The difference, of course, is that this is a signal that we have a very high degree of social and political organization. That the laying out of a city, the laying out of a town was a serious enterprise that was done in a hierarchical way with an intent, right? Now, this is very old, really old, and it's really difficult to know what exactly the intent was, and archaeologists, people who study these things, you know, there are whole conferences where they get together and this side of the room debates that side of the room on what all of this really was. Nonetheless, I wanted to point this out because it is in stark contrast to what we see in Mesopotamia, right? Stark contrast. Mohenjo-Daro does, in fact, exhibit some of the similar qualities, but in the case of Mohenjo-Daro, we don't have writing, we don't have other things, so we don't know, all right? If we look at Kahun, which is another Egyptian town, we see a similar thing. So this begins to suggest, in fact, that we have some similarities, that Akhenaten was not perhaps completely outside the mainstream of practice in terms of laying out cities as he was with the religion. But clearly what we have here is something which is planned in, as an overall idea of a city. It's a very thick wall that we see here, orthogonal geometries. There's what is probably a market area that we see in this settlement of Kahun. All of the flow of the Nile moving north is moving into the Mediterranean here and up these inland trade routes into the Hittite world, which is to the north. You see Çatalhöyük. See if I can identify this for you right here. Çatalhöyük, and then there we see Hattusis. This is the headquarters of the Hittite world. And there's also a sort of migration, very old, of these Indo-European speaking people who come down into what is modern Iran. It's actually where the word Aryan comes from, by the way, and Hitler had it all backwards. He didn't understand what he was doing. If we were in this area that we see right here, this is about where Göbekli Tepe is, and this is, of course, Jericho that we see right here. So this is a very, very old part of the world. This is the oldest. I mean, this has been settled for a long time, and cities began to emerge both here. Here is Lagash, Larsa, Uruk, is right there, Eridu, and then we see movement up the Tigris in the Euphrates Valley, and then we see it coming down along the Levant or the eastern Mediterranean coast. This is where the Phoenicians lived, who gave us the alphabet, and there's a tremendous amount of trade there. Now, as I mentioned in the last lecture, travel by rivers, travel by water, is in fact a whole lot easier than it is moving across the desert. So the eastern end of the Mediterranean becomes this sort of medium of exchange. Today we tend to think of the northern Mediterranean as being European and Christian, and the southern end of the Mediterranean being Muslim and North African, and that is true, but that is fairly late. That occurs in the Middle Ages. And all through the ancient world, the Mediterranean was sort of the glue that bound the north and the south ends of this great inland sea together, sort of like sitting around a table. It was sort of the medium through which exchange occurred. There are two islands that were critical in this. One is Cyprus and the other is Crete. Cyprus is now sort of split, I believe, Elpida, is this correct, between Turkey and Greece. No, it's a separate country? Separate country today? Okay. And Crete is part of Greece. But the people who lived on Crete in 2000 BCE were not, in fact, Greek, although the people who excavated it, the British, at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, Sir Arthur Evans, when he's digging in here, he believes he's digging in the Greek world. So guess when he restores something, guess what he restores it as? His prior belief that he was actually in the Greek world. What we now know, in fact, is that these were not Greek. They did not speak Greek. They spoke neither an Indo-European language nor a Semitic language. In fact, we don't really know who they are. Interestingly enough, the Palestinians believe that they are descended from the Minoans. And there may be some evidence of that because there was a great cataclysm, perhaps more than one, that occurred on the island of Crete a very long time ago that was really signaled the end of it. It made it all the way back to the 8th row. His eraser for something popped and went flying through the air. Thought actually he was shooting it at Aaron for a minute there. There were these two great cataclysmic events that eventually caused Crete to come under the control of a group of people from the Greek Peloponnesus, the Peloponnesian Peninsula, in the Bronze Age, and they spoke a different language, a kind of Proto-Greek, than what we have today.